Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf Pei Gimel is discussing when you feed somebody on Yom Kippur because of a sickness or other dangerous situation that requires him to eat. So there's a Mishnah that divides the daf in half. The first part of the daf discusses whose word you follow. Do you follow the word of an expert medical professional, a doctor, or do you follow the patient himself? And it'll depend on who says what, who says he needs to eat and who says he does not need to eat. The Gemara will go through a number of cases where the opinions stack up against each other and who you listen to. Then we'll get to the Mishnah, which will discuss a number of specific illnesses and cases and what the treatment is for that. The Gemara will continue with some of the treatments and situations in which you're allowed to violate certain Isurim in order to treat a medically ill person, and then a very famous Agadah to Gemara about someone by the name of Kidor. So let's begin. We are discussing whose opinion you listen to as to whether or not you should feed a patient, whether he's in a situation where it is sakanas nefashos for him to fast and he needs to eat. Now, generally our rule is that all things being equal, we will go leniently and feed a person. We will always err on the side of caution and give a person to eat even on Yom Kippur if all things are equal. So that means if we have evenly stacked opinions on both sides of the question, should we feed him or should we not, we're always going to feed him. So if we're going to see somebody saying a chiddush that we feed him, there has to be a reason that you would have thought that it's stronger otherwise, because if it's evenly stacked, there's no reason why you should think that. Now, we've seen in our Mishnah that said that you will feed a patient if two doctors say to feed him or if he himself says to feed him. Now, the Gemara brings two statements of Rav Yanai, and the Gemara is going to ask that it contradicts the Mishnah. Rav Yanai says as follows. Rav Yanai, the Amora, says if you have one patient against a doctor, who are you going to listen to? So Rav Yanai says you always listen to the one that says that he needs to eat and you feed him. If the doctor says he needs to eat and the patient says he doesn't, you listen to the doctor and you feed him. On the other hand, if the patient says he needs to eat and the doctor says he doesn't, you listen to the patient and you feed him. You always go l'kula and feed him. So Gemara asks pshita on each of these. It's obvious. Why shouldn't I think so? So the Gemara says, right, it's one against one. You should always listen to the one that, if it's one against one, we always go l'chumrah. We will always make sure to feed him, to err on the side of caution. So the Gemara says when the doctor is the one that says he does not need to eat, you may think, listen to the doctor. The doctor is a medical professional. He knows best. To that, Rav Yanai says, no, lev yuder maras nafsho. A patient knows himself even better than a doctor knows him. Now, when the patient is the one who says he does not need to eat and the doctor says he needs to eat, so there the chiddush is, you may think I should listen to the patient. He knows himself the best. So if for that we say no, even though the patient says he doesn't need to eat, it could be that his sickness is itself making him delirious, and that's why he's making mistakes. So now the Gemara asks that this doesn't fit with the Mishnah. The Mishnah clearly said that you need two doctors in order to permit a person to eat on Yom Kippur, not one doctor and not the patient himself. Now the Rishonim here ask, what do you mean? The Mishnah itself in the next line says that the patient himself is allowed to, the patient's word saying he needs to eat is enough to feed him. So they answer that at this point we're assuming that means the patient along with another doctor, as opposed to two doctors on the road. But leaving that question of the Rishonim and their answer aside, the Mishnah clearly says you need two doctors to permit somebody to eat on Yom Kippur. That does not fit with Rav Yanai, who said it's enough to have one doctor or enough to have the patient himself. Both of those are not true based on the Mishnah. The Mishnah says you need two doctors. So Gemara says, no. Okay, so the case of the Mishnah is referring to where the patient himself said he does not need to eat. To counteract him, you need to have two doctors. Gemara says that's not true. Rav Yanai said to counteract the patient himself, you only have to have one doctor that says he needs to eat. So it still doesn't fit. So Gemara says, okay, our case in the Mishnah is where the patient himself plus one doctor says he does not need to eat. The Mishnah teaches us to counteract that, you need to have two doctors that says he needs to eat. That makes it 2 against 2, and it's balanced. If it would be just one, you wouldn't feed him. It would be just one who says he needs to eat against two people, a doctor and the patient who say he doesn't need to eat. So Gemara says 2 and 2. The Mishnah is teaching me that when it's 2 against 2, you feed him. That's pashut. Of course you do. If it's even-handed, then you would err on the side of caution to feed him. What would be the chiddush? So Gemara says, okay, you're right. The case in the Mishnah actually is where it's 3 against 2. The patient plus 2 doctors say he does not need to eat, but 2 doctors say he does need to eat. Here, even though it's a minority saying he needs to eat, you will still feed him. And the reason is because it's 2, and 2 rides the day. Now, the Gemara explains why this is a chiddush. Generally, in testimony, we have a rule that 2 witnesses count as strong as 100 witnesses or 1,000,000 however it is, once you have 2 witnesses, there's no stronger testimony than that. 2 witnesses against 100 witnesses is considered even. It's not a question of votes. 2 is as good as 100. But that's only true as far as testimony, the Gemara says. Rav Safra says that's only true as far as testimony. But when you're getting a bunch of different professional opinions to evaluate something, there you go by majority. And 3 is stronger than 2, and 4 is stronger than 3. Says the Gemara, you would think that that's true as far as evaluating everything, but that's not. It's only true as evaluating monetary values. A question of a monetary dispute where you need an evaluation of a professional, there 3 is better than 2. Here, though, we're talking about whether a person needs to eat to be Machal Yom Kippur. There, 2 is just as good as 3. And therefore, if you have 2 doctors against 3 doctors, or 2 opinions against 3 opinions, or the combination of doctors and the patient himself, you'll go with the 2 lakula that say he needs to eat. You'll always go with that opinion. So now the Gemara says there's a kash on this whole approach. This whole approach that you're saying that the case in the Mishnah is where the patient himself says he doesn't need to eat. The problem is that in the end of the Mishnah, the patient is saying he needs to eat. Because the end of the Mishnah says if there's no professionals there and the patient himself says he needs to eat, then you listen to him and you feed him. So how can you tell me that the first part of the Mishnah is where the patient says he doesn't need to eat, and the second part he says he does need to eat? It doesn't say that. So you have to put words in. The Mishnah's chesure, machzera, and it says as follows. The first part of the Mishnah is referring to where the patient says, I do not need to eat. But if the patient says he needs to eat, and there aren't 2 experts, there's only either one expert. There's only one expert who says he doesn't need to eat, and he himself is believed. Even against one full expert, he's believed, like Rav Yanai said, that if he says he needs to eat, he's believed and he needs to eat. That's the halach. Okay, now the Gemara brings another opinion of an Amar. Up to now we've been discussing Rav Yanai. The next opinion here is Mar bar Rav Ashi. Mar bar Rav Ashi says, anytime the patient says he needs to eat, you feed him. It doesn't matter how many doctors say he doesn't need to eat. The word of the patient is so strong. Lev Yodei Amaras Nafsho, a person knows his own illness. He knows his body better than any number of doctors. Even if you have 100 doctors that are saying he doesn't need any food, if he says he needs to eat, you feed him. So Gemara says, how does that fit with the Mishnah again? The Mishnah says only if you have 2 experts. If you have 2 experts, you will follow the opinion of 2 experts. How could you tell me that I'll follow his own opinion when he says he needs to eat against them? So the Gemara answers, you read it as follows. You say if there are, the phrasing of the Mishnah that our problem was that it says that if there are no expert opinions, then you listen to the patient himself. That implies if there are expert opinions that say otherwise, you won't listen to him. The Gemara says no. What it means is if there are other expert opinions, but he says differently, those expert opinions count as if there's no opinions. Meaning if he says he needs to eat, it's as all that's always considered as if there are no expert opinions around, even if there are expert opinions who contradict him. His word cancels out all other opinions that there are out there, and you will feed him. Okay, now we get to the Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses a number of cases of illness. First, it talks about a disease called bulmus. Bulmus is a disease where someone is gripped by a tremendous hunger, and he must eat, and his eyes grow dim, and his skin becomes pale, and he's in a situation of life-threatening. It's threatening to life unless he eats, and he eats as much as he needs to until his eyes relight again, and he gains back his spirit. So if somebody's in a situation like that, so you feed him anything. This is not only talking about Yom Kippur. You feed him even tamei foods, even kosher foods, until he's restored to his full sight, if that's what he needs, and there's nothing obviously kosher around to feed him. Now, somebody that's bitten by a mad dog. So what's halacha there? So a common cure is that they would feed him liver of the dog itself. So the Gemara says machlokes tanaim whether that's a real cure or not. The Tanna Kama says that's not a real cure. Doesn't really work. It's what the doctors do. But you cannot feed non-kosher food to the guy for a cure which is not really going to work. Ramasi ben Charish though says that it is a real cure and it is going to work, and therefore you are able to feed him even non-kosher liver like that. Now the Mishnah brings another halacha of Ramasi ben Charash. This is somebody who has pain in his throat, could be a life-threatening situation. You give him medication even on Shabbos, and it pushes off all of Hilchos Shabbos, and you're allowed to. Now, speaking of Hilchos Shabbos, the Mishnah says somebody who is caught in a pile of rubble, he's in a building or something that collapsed on top of him, so you're allowed to dig through the stones, even though that's Chilul Shabbos. You're allowed to dig through the stones to try to find him, see if he's alive. You might save his life. That's even if you're not sure he was in the building. Even if you're not sure if he was alive or dead at the time that the stones fell on him, even if you're not sure if he's a Jew or not, you're always allowed to dig through the stones on the possibility that there might be a live Jew there whose life needs to be saved. Now, once you reach him, if you find that he's alive, so you keep on working until you free him. If you find that he died, you leave him because there's no longer any case of Sakanas Nefashos here, and you can leave him there until after Shabbos. The Gemara now begins, and the Gemara asks, how are you supposed to know that he's cured from his bulmus? We said when his eyes light up. What does it mean when his eyes light up? How are you supposed to know when that is? The Gemara says, the Gemara brings a baye, when you can tell between good and bad, good flavor and bad flavor. You feed him good flavor and he likes it, and bad flavor and he doesn't like it. Oh, he doesn't like food anymore? That means that if there's such a thing as food that he doesn't like, that means he's already cured from his bulmus, and you don't have to feed him as an emergency anymore. Now, the Gemara says when you're feeding him, you always try to avoid Isser as much as you can, and if you have a number of choices, you go with the lightest Isser. Now the Gemara is going to stack up a number of different Isurim against Tevel. Tevel is grain which has not had its Truma and Meiser taken from it. It's a very strong Isser. So Gemara says if you have nevela, unslaughtered or improperly slaughtered meat against the tevel, rather feed him the nevela. Nevela is just a lav, tevel is misa b'dei shamayim. Then Gemara says, what about tevel against shemitah produce? Better just feed him shemitah produce. Now, tevel against truma. That's both situations of misa b'dei shamayim. So what are you supposed to do there? So Gemara says it's a machlokes tanaim. There's a brisa where one says you feed him tevel and not truma, one says you feed him truma and not tevel. Now, Rabbah qualifies the case. He says we're referring to a very specific situation, and the Gemara will discuss whether we agree with Rabbah or not. Rabbah says we're referring to where we have a large amount of tevel. Now, if we were to feed him all that tevel, that would be enough to cure him. On the other hand, if we would take off truma right now, and only feed him the chulin that's left, if we take off truma and what's left over, that would not be enough to cure him. Now, if the chulin would be enough to cure him after I take off the truma, so everybody would agree. Of course, you should give him the chulin, just the chulin, and that's enough to cure him. There's no isser involved. But we're talking about where if you take off truma, it won't be tevel anymore, but you're going to have to feed him the actual truma. So, the situation then is, what should you do? Should I leave it as tevel and feed him tevel, or should I take off truma and I'm going to have to feed him the chulin and the truma together, then he'll be eating truma and he's a non-kohen. So the basis of this machlokes is, which is a stronger isser, and the logic behind it is as follows. Truma is on the one hand a weaker isser, because kohanim are allowed to eat truma. Tevel, on the other hand, is a bit of a weaker isser, because tevel you could fix. Tevel is a fixable isser. You can take off truma and it won't be tevel anymore. So that's this machlokes. So the Gemara says, why did Rava have to tell me that if I have enough chulin, if I take off truma and there's enough chulin left to solve the problem, that I should just feed him the chulin? Of course, obviously, what's the chiddush there? So the Gemara says the chiddush is that it's Shabbos. Even though it's Shabbos and you're not allowed to take off truma on Shabbos, the Isser Derabanan to fix food by taking off truma on Shabbos, we're saying that even if that's the situation, you should still take off the truma and fix it, violate the Isser Derabanan in order to feed him the chulin and not a tevel. So the Gemara says, well, that's also, of course, it's only an Isser Derabanan. Why would I think that? I should feed the guy tevel rather than do an Isser Derabanan of fixing it? For sure not. The Gemara says, no, we're talking about where the tevel itself is also Derabanan. So it's tevel Derabanan against the Isser of separating Truma Midarabanan, and we'd rather you separate Truma and violate that Isser Derabanan rather than feed him Tevel Derabanan, because we're afraid if you feed him Tevel Derabanan, you're going to end up feeding people Tevel, which is Tevel Diraisa. Now, what's Tevel Derabanan? Tevel Derabanan is if this grain didn't grow in the ground, it grew in a flower pot that does not have a hole. It does not gain its nourishment from the ground. It's a totally sealed off flower pot, so that's called the Tevel Derabanan. And that's the case that we are discussing. So now the Gemara says that this issue of Tevel Derabanan against the Isser of Shabbos, of taking off Truma on Shabbos, that issue, which one is the stronger, is a Machlokes Tanaim. So maybe this statement of Rabbah is actually dependent on this Machlokes Tanaim. Where do we see a Machlokes Tanaim? I have a brisa that says somebody is bitten by a snake. So you can do the following things. You can call him a doctor from somewhere far away, even if he has to travel far. You're allowed to cut open a chicken that gives you a cure for that. You're allowed to shear types of wool or cut off types of growing things that can help to cure him. And you're also allowed to feed them to him, and you don't have to take meiser. That's according to Rebbe. Elazar Shimon says, no, you should take Meiser. So here we have a machlokes between Rebbe and Rebbe Elazar ben Reb Shimon. Should I take off Meiser from these growing vegetables or not? Now, vegetables are only obligated in Truma Midir Abanan. So it's a very similar thing. The Gemara says this is probably the same machlokes. We're talking about Shabbos, Truma Dir Abanan, and we have the same. We have a very similar machlokes between Rebbe and Rebbe Elazar ben Reb Shimon. Should I take off Meiser and violate the Isser of taking Meiser on Shabbos, or should I feed it to him and it's Tevel Derabanan? Says the Gemara, no. Really, both opinions would agree to Rebbe's halacha. Rebbe is talking about where it's in a flower pot. It's in a flower pot without a hole. That's very easy to mix up with Tevel Deraisa. On that, everybody would agree we would rather you take off Truma and Meiser and not feed somebody that Tevel, even though it's only Derabanan. Here, though, in the case of the vegetables, there, Rebbe says you don't have to take off the Meiser, you could just leave it. Because nobody's going to confuse vegetables with grain. That's a very distant thing, and therefore we don't have a problem, we're not concerned for it. Okay, the Gemara now discusses the concept of bulmus more at length. So the Gemara brings a price that discusses cures for bulmus. It says that somebody who's gripped by the bulmus disease, you should feed him honey and all types of sweet things, because honey and sweet things bring the light back to a person's eyes. How do you see that? Well, there's no proof to it, but there is an indication from a pasuk, which appears in Shmuel. The pasuk says, "Vayomer Yonason Achar Avi Haaretz Re'una Ki Oyru Einai Ki Ta'amti Me'at Vashazeh." He said, my eyes lit up because I tasted a little bit of this honey. So Gemara says, what do you mean? That's just a hint. That's pretty clear. That's almost straight out. He said, my eyes lit up because I tasted a little bit of this honey. Gemara says, yeah, but he wasn't talking about bulmos. He was talking about other things. He was talking about the fact that he is happier. But it's not a bulmus cure that's discussing over there. Says Gemara that this cure of eating honey only applies after somebody has eaten regular food. But if he's eating it on an empty stomach, that just causes him greater desire for real food, and therefore it would have a opposite effect. You don't want that to happen. It brings a pasuk that supports that. And that is also in Shmuel, and it says, "Vayimsu ish mitzri basadev yikhu oisai el David vayinu lei lechem vayocha vayishku mayim vayinu lei pelach davelo shnei tzimukim vayocha vatasha rucha elov ki lo achal lechem v'lo yishas mayim shloshi yamim v'shlosha leilos." They gave him food, and it restored him because he had not eaten for 3 days and for 3 nights. That's why it restored. Okay, now the Gemara says further. Rav Nachman says, in the name of Shmuel, somebody who has bulmus, you should feed him the alya, the fatty tail of a sheep, mixed with honey. Rav Huda bread of Yeshua says you should also feed him clean bread, clear bread, dipped in honey. Rav Papa says you could even feed him flour of barley dipped in honey. Rav Yochanan says, one time I was walking and I was gripped by a bulmus, and I ran to the east side of a fig tree, and I took figs from there, and I saved my life, and I fulfilled the pasuk on myself that says, "Chachma techaya b'le'ah," wisdom gives life to those who know it, because they know. The Bryce that Rav Yosef said that somebody who wants to have good figs should take from the eastern side specifically because that's where the sun first shines. Based on the pasuk that says, "Umimeged tvu es shamesh," from the place where the sun shines, that is where the better crops and grains are. Now the Gemara brings a story, which will lead into another story. The Gemara says, Rav Yehuda and Rav Yossi were walking along the way, and Rabbi Yehuda got struck by bulmus. So he went to the nearest shepherd, and he grabbed away his bread, and he ate it. So Rav Yossi said, you ripped off that shepherd. Why were you allowed to do that? Anyway, they traveled further, and they got to the city, and as soon as they got to the city, Rav Yossi this time was struck by the bulmus disease. And all the townspeople came, and they surrounded him with all kinds of sweet foods and cooked appetizings. So he ate them from them. So Rabbi Yehuda said to him, I ripped off the shepherd, but you ripped off the whole town. Now the Gemara brings another story with the travels of these two Tanaim, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, and also Rav Meir. The Gemara says Rav Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yossi were traveling along the way. And Rav Meir used to pay careful attention to a person's name. He would say that based on a person's name, you could figure out about his character. Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi were not careful with a person's name. So when they came to an inn, and they wanted to stay in the inn, so they asked the innkeeper, what's your name? He said, Kidor. So said Rabbi Meir, who was Medayik in their names, Kedar, that means he's a Rasha, like the Pasuk says, Kedar Tapuchos Hema. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi stored their money with him, and Rabbi Meir did not store his money with him. He went and he hid it in the grave of the innkeeper's father's headstone. At the headstone, that's where he hid it. Anyway, that night the innkeeper had a dream. His father came to him and he said, "Come take the money that's hidden by my head." So he got up in the morning and he told his distinguished guests about this dream that he had, and they said, a Friday night dream doesn't count for anything. But Rabbi Meir was suspicious, and therefore he went to guard his wallet, which was hidden there. He stood there all Shabbos to guard his wallet so it wouldn't get stolen. You never knew what that guy would do. Anyway, in the end, they came and they asked the innkeeper for their money back, and he said, "I know what you're talking about. No money. You never gave me any money." So Rabbi Meir said, "I told you he's a Rasha. Why didn't you pay attention to his name?" He said, "You didn't tell us anything. You knew he was Rasha. Why didn't you warn us?" So he said, "Look, his name is enough to make me suspicious. I can't assume he's going to steal your money to go so far to tell you that I couldn't tell you." Anyway, so they went and they figured out a trick to get their money back from him. They invited him to a store, gave him some wine to drink, and they saw that he had lentils in his mustache. So went and they told his wife, "Your husband said to give back the wallets, and the sign that he gave is that you and him had lentils for breakfast this morning." So she gave it back, and when he found out about it, he killed her. That, says the Gemara, is a source of the saying that not washing before bread caused the person to eat pork, and not washing after the meal caused the person to kill human. And that is this case here. That's what it's referring to, because they didn't wash at the end of the meal. Had he washed, he would have wiped his mustache with his wet fingers and not had lentils on his mustache, and his wife's life would have been saved. As far as the pork story, that's a different story somewhere else, where someone went to a restaurant and he didn't wash, and therefore they thought he was a guy and served him pork, which he otherwise could have avoided. Now, from then on, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi did pay careful attention to people's names, and when they stayed in a different place and the person's name was Bala, they said, "Oh, we're not staying here. This guy must be your Rasha," like the pasuk says, "Omar leBala neufim." Bala is a nefarious character who engages in immoral behavior. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to discuss a Kelev Shota, a mad dog. The Gemara brings a brayso that says there are 5 signs of a mad dog. His mouth hangs open, and he pants. There is drool running from his mouth. His ears are folded over and hanging down. His tail is on his hind legs, and he walks on the side of the road. And there's some who say he also barks but does not make a sound. Now, what causes it? The Gemara brings 2 opinions. Rav says that there are women who are practicing witchcraft on him, and Shmuel says that there's an evil spirit that has taken hold of him, a ruach ra. What's the difference? The Gemara says whether you can kill him by throwing something at him. If it's a ruach ra, so you can't get close to him, you're going to kill him, you have to throw something at him. Don't go up to him with a knife. However, if it's just a kishuf, then you can.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.